Bury Bones in the Midnight Soil by V.E.Schwab is one of the most beautifully written books about vampires that truly explores every possible meaning of the word hungry. We have three different female characters, three vampires, three very different stories in three extremely different eras, three different views on bloodthirst, but they only have one thing in common. They're hungry. They're hungry for blood, for love, for freedom, but the way that they express that hunger and the way that they satisfy it is extremely different. So the book is written in three different perspectives. We have Sabine, Alice, and Charlotte. And the book starts with us being introduced to two of the characters, Alice and Sabine. Sabine's story starts in 1500s, where she's married off to a viscount, and she very quickly discovers that this is not quite the life that she wants to live. Her pleasure, her desires, her wishes are entirely not important. She's just there to give viscount children, to be the obedient wife, nothing more than that. So when she meets a widow, she discovers that she's somewhat envious of that freedom of a life without a husband, of a life without a man. And when that widow offers her the same freedom, Sabine is more than happy to say yes. And that's how we learn the story of Sabine, the vampire. And she is completely unapologetically herself. She's hungry. She loves to kill. She loves to drink blood. She loves to take life. And she doesn't stop to think of the impact that she's having on the world by doing so. She's just enjoying herself and she's having the most fun that she's ever had. Very quickly, you discover that Sabine only cares about Sabine, no more and no less. And then on the other end, we have Alice's story, and it starts in 2019, where Alice, who's incredibly shy, a little bit mousy, she doesn't really go to parties. She's invited to a frat party, to a college party, and the beginning of her story starts with her standing in front of the mirror and convincing herself to be somebody different, to truly have fun, to truly enjoy, to be a completely different person, to elevate that fun on a whole different level. And she's scared to do that because her entire life she kind of lived in her sister's shadow. She's never been her own person. So stepping out of that shadow and being herself and trying to enjoy the world for what it is really scary for Alice. And she's never wanted to become a vampire. For her, this is truly the end of her life. For Sabine, it was just the beginning, and Alice is very hungry for justice. And then Charlotte's story gets introduced later in the book, and I'm not gonna say anything because I feel like that would be a spoiler, but it's truly my favorite story. Charlotte as a character is somewhat of a middle ground between the two. She's hungry for love, she's hungry for acceptance, she's hungry for finding that place in the world where she would truly fit. And once she becomes a vampire, she truly burdens herself with the question of the value of the human life, of whether they need to kill to satisfy that hunger. And she becomes incredibly conscious of the price that she has to pay for the life that she's now living. So, where in Sabine's case, being a vampire has given her the freedom that she's always desired, in Charlotte's case, unfortunately, it's put the shackles on her. And so, throughout the book, you follow these three stories, these very differently developing stories, incredibly different characters. They all process becoming a vampire incredibly differently because Sabine, she sort of wanted it. For her, that was her ticket to freedom, her ticket to taking the control of her life and taking the power in her own hands. Charlotte, she never really wanted that. She just wanted to fit in and be loved and be accepted. Alice, for her, that's the worst nightmare. So the three stories are very different, and you're following them in three very different eras, and then eventually you sort of watch them tie in together in the same timeline. And you sort of get to see V.E.Schwab's take on vampires. You discover the rules of this world, the rules of this life, of what they can do, of what they can't do. So they can, for example, go out in the sunlight, but they will become ill, they will have a very bad cold, and they will feel horrible after that. So they can do it as a choice, but there's a price to pay. They can walk into churches without any issues, but they cannot be at any burial grounds because that kind of sucks the life out of them. And I also find it fascinating to explore V.E.Schwab's take on, your personal space, your home. So she stays with the idea of a vampire has to be invited into somebody's home, but the idea of the home grows where Sabine meets a vampire throughout her travels around the world, and his entire home is a city. He claimed the city as his house. And all of that sounds incredibly interesting. And V.E.Schwab's writing is absolutely beautiful. It's so poetic. It's a pleasure to read. But my only complaint is that unfortunately it felt a little bit slow paced. And I thought it was very unexpected. I found it slow paced because you would think that it would be incredibly dynamic, especially Sabine's story, where you're following so many years of her journey and her exploring the world and exploring the rules of being a vampire and living in this whole new world for her, meeting different people, meeting different vampires, finding out different stories and different ways of life, you would think that that would feel very fast paced, but unfortunately, at times, it felt a little bit static. And interestingly enough, I found that the bit of the story before they become vampires, their lives as humans, how they kind of came to be vampires, what led to them becoming vampires, and their initial reaction to becoming vampires, what they do with their life, how they act, what they think, how they interact with humans and human life. I thought that was the most interesting part of the book because you know that they will become vampires, but you feel that almost giddy anticipation of how is it going to happen? What's going to happen? How will they feel when they become vampires? I thought that was the best part of the book. And I think in that sense, Charlotte's story was a bit of a breath of fresh air because you get it closer to the middle of the book where you've already explored a very big chunk of Sabine's life and you already know how Alice feels and you sort of, you know their thoughts, you know their personalities, you know their characters. I think at that point I started getting a little bit bored of the story. So Charlotte's story has starting with being a human and telling us about her human life and showing her human life and her struggles and what she wants from life, what she craves, what she's hungry for, and then her becoming a vampire and how she deals with that. That was truly a breath of fresh air in the middle of the book. I really needed that. That made me want to continue reading and want to finish the book. Not that I was truly considering DNFing it, but in the middle, I was getting a little bit bored. And I also really like that Schwab chooses to not make them monsters. So in her story, the entire life is a garden, and vampire is a feral rose in that garden. Something beautiful, but something dangerous, something deadly. And I thought that that was a wonderful idea. It sort of gives me a bit of a vibe of Twilight bad vampires. You know, Jasper's story of how Jasper became a vampire. Those vampires that were described in that story, that's kind of the vibe that I was getting, at least from Sabine. I also know that V.E.Schwab was heavily inspired by Vampire Lestat by Anne Rice. So I would be very curious to go and reread that. I read it as a teenager. And you kind of feel those influences, at least from what I remember from Anne Rice. It's a very similar vibe, it's a very similar atmosphere and mood. And I truly think it's a worthwhile read, even though I would admit that sometimes pacing is a little bit slow and it can get a little bit boring and at times slightly tedious. But the writing is beautiful. Just for that, I think it's more than worth it. Her take on vampires is beautiful, her characters are beautiful, the stories are good, and she does truly make them something very unique. So I think as long as you go in with correct expectations and you don't crave something very dynamic and something very fast paced, you will have a very good time, especially if you enjoy that style of writing and especially if you've read V.E.Schwab before, which I haven't. That was my introduction to her writing, and I can safely say that after this book, I will definitely pick up some of her other books because from what I've had, the other ones are even better than Bury Our Bones in the Midnight Soul. So I'm incredibly excited. But with that said, if you have read this book and if you have any thoughts, any comments, whether you agree with me or not, I would really love to chat about it. So please leave a comment down below and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.